Hello, my name is Ted Ritzer, and I'm the host of the Greening Government Webinar Speaker Series. That series is a collaboration between my department, Alberta Environment and Parks, the Alberta Climate Change Office, and the Municipal Climate Change Action Center. Sort of the way our speaker series works is we have 40 minutes presentation followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. During the Q&A, I'll monitor the Q&A window and repeat the question for our speaker. Today, we're very fortunate to have a presentation on a project that is probably one of the highest profile decarbonization projects on the planet. It's Low Carbon London, which is a smart grid innovation program. And we're joined by Rich Hampshire, who is CGI's lead for smart utilities and global smart initiatives. Rich's background is he's both electrical and a mechanical engineer, but he's got 25 years of experience in the utility sector, gained from a variety of leadership roles with utility companies, including energy retail, energy services, energy markets, policy and regulation, and smart meter and grid strategy, as well as providing technical advisory services. And he did sit on the steering group for Low Carbon London. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Rich Hampshire, our speaker for today.
Hi, good morning all, and thank you, Ted, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be joining you. It's late afternoon my time over here in the UK, and I know it's the start of the working day for your good selves. It's my privilege to share some of the learning this morning around Low Carbon London, which was a utility-led UK Power Networks, which is the utility for the London area in the UK, led the project, and CGI, the company that I represent, provided a number of the IT services as part of the project. Ted has already done an excellent job at introducing myself. The highlights from my career essentially are that I spent a lot of time working in utilities before I moved into the IT sector. But in the IT sector, it's very much focused on how IT is used within utilities, and focused on the future utility and how in this ever increasingly connected world, they will be able to better manage their networks and minimize the impact of the adoption of low carbon technologies on their businesses, both on the supply side and on the demand side, as we all as consumers adopt more low carbon technologies, both in our homes and the way we transport ourselves to and from work and to our friends and our social occasions. So just to give you an overview of what I'll cover today, and I've said to Ted, I'm more than happy to take questions as we move through. So if you raise them through your screen, Ted will signal to me that he's got a question, and I will pick that up as we go through. I will do the obligatory introduction to who CGI are, just very, very briefly. I'm also a great believer, based on my experience, that it's important to understand what's driving projects like Low Carbon London in the local market. So I'll provide a bit of context for you around the British market and what the drivers are for the low carbon move over here in the UK. And in doing so, hopefully that will allow you to draw parallels with the drivers in your own market. And if appropriate, please ask your questions and we can discuss around how the learning from Low Carbon London might apply locally for yourselves. And smart grids tends to be one of those phrases that can mean a lot of different things to different people. So I'll explain what we understand by a smart grid so that we're talking from a common language. And then I'll get into some of the specifics around Low Carbon London. It was subtitled A Learning Journey because it was very much around testing thoughts and hypotheses around what operating a network that has a lot of low carbon technologies connected to it, how you might need to design and operate that going forward. So very much the focus was on learning. And then I'll focus in on just two aspects of the learning that I think you will hopefully find interesting, one being the electrification of transport and the other being around engaging consumers. And then we can more openly, I think we've got about 20 minutes for discussion, questions, clarifications. And at the back of the slide pack, there's some links and some further references. If I've got you hooked, you can do some more of your own research. So a brief introduction to CGI. If you're not aware of us, CGI was started a little over 40 years ago, actually in Canada, and our executive chairman today is one of the founders of the company. The company's grown over that 40-year period to be a global company. We're in 40 of the major countries around the world. It says 65,000 on the slide, but we're currently up to about 68,000 people. And part of our model is that the majority of our members are shareholders in the company. We work with about 25,000 clients around the globe, and about 250 of those around the globe are utilities, water companies, electricity companies, gas companies. Primarily what we do is IT and business services. So very much system integration, development of applications, integration of those applications with third-party products, and supporting and operating those within data centers on behalf of our clients. So on to a little bit about the British market context. If you're unfamiliar with the British market, it's a fully privatized market. We started privatization back in about 1990, and it's one of the most deregulated and unbundled markets anywhere in the world. When I use a term like unbundled, what I mean is we've separated functions across the supply chain. So initially we separated generation activities from the supply activities. We separated the transmission and distribution of electricity from the retail supply of energy, and latterly we've separated the provision of other services like metering services out of the distribution businesses, which is traditionally in most markets where you will find metering services. So for a lot of our clients, it's very much a strategic decision. It's a business decision, which bits of the value chain they operate within. So we have some pure energy retailers. We have some pure energy networks businesses, distribution businesses. We have a single transmission system operator in the UK, but very much it is a market-led utilities market. If I move on, it's also one of the markets, one of the consistently most competitive markets anywhere around the globe. Typically annually, 15 to 20% of domestic consumers will switch their supplier to a new supplier, and around 70-75% of consumers have switched at least once in the last 20 years to a new supplier and are not with their traditional regional energy supplier. So hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the complexities and the number of actors that we have in the market. Now, to give you a sense of what's driving what we call the low carbon transition and the challenge it gives for our electricity utilities here in the UK. The UK has bought very heavily into the Paris Protocol, the climate change commitments, and we've taken on legally binding targets to reduce carbon intensity across the UK against the base of the 1990 level. The challenge for us in order to meet our targets, and the ultimate target is the 2050 target there of 160 megatons of CO2 equivalent, is that from an electricity perspective, the electricity sector will have to do the heavy lifting, because a lot of the other sectors are looking to decarbonise through electrification. So the transport sector is looking to move to electric vehicles or electrically driven trains. The process industries are looking at using more electricity. In the home, we're looking to transfer heating to electrically driven heating, be that either via heat pumps or electric thermal storage heaters. So the electricity sector in the UK will take a disproportionate impact, and essentially by 2050 has to be fully decarbonised. So we're already in the process of any new generation capacity that is coming in. That generation capacity is renewable energy, so it's coming from wind turbines, it's coming from potentially some new nuclear, it's coming from solar arrays, and it's the adoption of those new technologies which is causing a new driver for change in our whole electricity system. So it's probably worth, as I said, just saying, what do we mean when we talk about smart grids? And there's a European-wide definition that I'd like to draw a couple of key phrases out of, and it's there for you to read. Electricity networks can intelligently integrate the behaviour and actions of all the users that are connected to it. So that's the generators, the guys who are connecting power stations, wind arrays, solar arrays, to the distribution and the transmission systems, the consumers who are connecting new low carbon demands and potentially micro generators within the home, and those that do both. There's this buzz phrase kicking around, I'm not sure whether it's made its way over to Canada, of a prosumer. So that's a consumer that has the ability to generate as well. And the driver for this is, in order to efficiently deliver sustainable, economic and secure supplies of electricity. Generally in the UK, we talk about the primary element of that being the reliability of supply, the security of electricity supplies. But equally, the cost of energy is important. It affects each of our disposable incomes, because we tend to buy energy in front of other consumable goods. So the affordability of energy is a critical issue, and if we're going to meet climate change targets, then we have to do that from sustainable sources. So what does that translate to? As I said, energy security is the lead here, and in the UK, if we're going to secure our energy supplies, maintain their reliability, then we have to satisfy it differently from low carbon sources. And that means we've got to change the way we think about energy. So there is a significant behavioural aspect to this. Perhaps one of the greatest testaments to the success of the utilities sector is the fact that we as consumers have come to take affordable, reliable energy supplies for granted. If we'd have been having this conversation even 30 or 40 years ago, power outages were quite common. Today, they're an irritation because the reliability of energy supply has become very, very good. Certainly in Britain, that's true. So what does it mean? And I've already touched on some of these things. Transport, the way we travel around, will be more electrified, and we will move away from our addiction to fossil fuel driven transport and the associated carbon emissions and other particulates that are generating air pollution and the associated health hazards. We'll be doing more heating, both industrial and home space heating, through the use of heat pumps. I know in a lot of territories in North America, you have quite a lot of air conditioning which have heat pumps associated with it. Very, very few domestic premises in the UK have got any form of heat pump that's used for heating and or cooling of our homes. There'll be more microgeneration and embedded generation closer to the point of use rather than the big central generating plants. But the nature of those central generating plants is going to be changing as well. The big, flexible coal and gas power stations of old are going to be changed for low carbon solar arrays, low carbon wind arrays, but they are more intermittent, and that has a level of inflexibility associated to it. Why is that significant? There's a great reference in Hawaii where they've got a lot of solar power, but actually the peak solar generation correlates very, very closely with peak use of air conditioning. Unfortunately for us in the UK, our peak demand generally comes in the middle of cold, wet, dark winter evenings when solar generation isn't at its peak. So we have to think about how we can match demand against the availability of that supply, that low carbon supply. And that means we're going to be designing and operating our energy system as a whole differently. It will require more intelligence in doing it, which requires more of an interconnected data and information driven system, a smarter grid. I thought it'd be useful at this stage just to share an animation. It's part of a longer video. The full video can be seen at this YouTube link that was put together by UK Power Networks when we were originally working together to conceive the scope of low carbon London. It's about 3 minutes long, but hopefully it will give you a sense of what low carbon London, in terms of its aspiration and scope, was about.
So let's take a look at a community in the low carbon London of the future. As well as taking low carbon electricity production from microgeneration, like solar PV roof panels, and combined cooling and heating power systems, our network is now supplying electric vehicles and domestic heat pumps. And we've learned how to influence energy demand to make best use of local low carbon energy production and centralized nuclear and wind generation. We've monitored electric vehicle demand patterns at street and workplace locations and influenced charging behavior to maximize use of network capacity and low carbon generation. And we've discovered how to develop our network to accommodate increasing levels of local low carbon electricity production while supporting the efficient use of centralized nuclear and wind power. And having installed smart meters in thousands of residential homes in the Mayor's low carbon zones and in the Green Enterprise District, we know all about the many opportunities that smart meters offer to electricity distributors, suppliers, and most importantly, customers. When it comes to the city's major business customers and businesses within the Green Enterprise District, we understand how innovative commercial arrangements with commercial aggregators can incentivize businesses to make better use of low-carbon electricity and network capacity while helping the transmission system operator to balance the national electricity system more efficiently. It hasn't been an easy journey, but we've achieved our ultimate goal: to find the most efficient and cost-effective way to make our distribution network enable a low-carbon future for London. In the lead-up to 2020, when everyone was talking about a low-carbon economy, our distribution network helped organisations like Transport for London, the Institute for Sustainability and the Greater London Authority to realise some of their carbon reduction ambitions. By focusing on real London communities, We changed the way we work with our partners and customers, empowering them to reduce their carbon footprint. We help them benefit financially by reducing their electricity consumption at times of peak demand or reduced availability of intermittent wind and solar power. And our low-carbon London Learning Laboratory has been at the heart of all this, capturing the research and learning, helping to enable more low-carbon communities across the UK. UK Power Networks has remained at the centre of London's low-carbon initiatives, working with our partners to manage our network more efficiently and innovatively. We've made radical changes to the way we manage our distribution network and are now well on the way to delivering a low-carbon London.
Hi, back with you. So hopefully that gave you an indication of the scope and the aspiration of the project that I'm now going to talk about. There's a number of key themes that I think come out in that video. That video was made in 2010 as part of setting out the vision for this project. The key themes that I'll keep coming back to are the significance of the deployment of smart meters and the fact that they create the basis of a future energy system. They create the information and communication infrastructure on which a smart grid starts to be built. There was a lot of reference to changing behaviours, both consumer behaviours, but also the behaviours and the way businesses work to achieve the low carbon future. And there's also a very strong theme, and that's what I'd like you to take away from this particular slide, is about the necessity to collaborate, just not across the value chain, but the Mayor of London's office, for instance, was a key contributor to this project. They were looking at how they could engage London citizens in the wider aspects of policy to reduce pollution, to decarbonise London, to improve health outcomes, for London to become a smarter city. Enabling organisations like the Institute of Sustainability, utilities from across the value chain, from National Grid, our transmission system operator, EDF Energy, one of the energy retailers and one of the energy generators within the UK, UK Power Networks itself as the distribution business operating the infrastructure within London, Transport for London, who run the buses and the trains and the underground around London, a key user of energy within London, ourselves and other IT companies supplying both the IT and the grid technologies to UK Power Networks and as part of this project, and as well academia. Imperial College London, a recognised leading academic institution, provided the learning lab that was referenced. So Low Carbon London had really three key areas that it was interested in understanding. How would networks need to be designed? How would they need to change the traditional ways of designing and building networks to support these new low carbon technologies, both on the supply side, but also critically on the demand side? And what is the opportunity to control demand, so-called demand side response or demand side flexibility, in order to match it to supply? How will they need to operate their networks and operate their assets, given the fact that both supply and demand is changing and will change as low carbon technologies are adopted onto the networks? And what are the new commercial arrangements that they will need to put in place in order to access demand side response, in order to reward consumers and get consumers to either change behaviour or to make their demand side flexibility available? So the sort of technologies we were trialling, the sort of use cases we were testing, you've heard me talk about demand side response, demand side flexibility, very much looking at, can we get consumers to be willing to get involved. Once they've said they're willing to be involved, can we get them to move their demand to when energy and supply is available? And that, as part of this trial, was called wind twinning. So could we get consumers to reduce their demand when there was no wind generation? Or could we get them to increase their demand when supply of energy from the wind arrays was abundant? Could we make use and get access to distributed or demand side generation? And what was the impact of growing levels of electrification of heat and transport? And particularly of interest to a company like CGI in the IT sector is what's that going to mean in terms of the systems, the IT systems, the tools and the operating practices that our utility clients will be doing. What did CGI do as part of this project? We provided our smart data service, which gave them access to data from smart meters and allowed EDF Energy and UK Power Networks to communicate with customers and incentivize them through dynamic time of use tariffs to change their behavior. We supplied the program office. We helped them account for the real carbon impacts of the different initiatives, and we worked with them supplying consultancy on the design and the security design for this program. And to give you a sense of low carbon London, it's been recognised by two independent analysts, IDC Energy Insights and Ovum, have both done reports on this project and recognise it as a significant contributor to smart grid learning. And one of the key things that I think is different to low carbon London is it's far more than a technology project. It has involved end consumers, is involved parties across the value chain, and help to understand the commercial arrangements on how we get people involved far more and put people back in touch with how they use energy, so they no longer take energy for granted. So in terms of the structure of the project, it was focused around three key themes. One around the ability to control demand and distributed generation, what it would mean in terms of planning and operation of the actual network's infrastructure itself, and the implications on the network for the electrification of heat and transport. There were 6 trials areas. Because of the size of the project, I'm going to only really look at 2 areas that I think may well be of interest to yourselves. One is around dynamic time of use tariffs, and the other is on the electrification of heat and transport. But there was one key learning objective, particularly for UK Power Networks, and that was what would a future distribution system operator look like that was supporting low carbon technologies and controlling the demand and supply on its network potentially in near real time. So when we set out on this journey back in 2010, there was a lot of concern that the electrification of heat and transport would cause new peak demands, particularly around the late afternoon, early evening, when people are getting home from work and behaviourally are just plugging their electric vehicles in or turning their now electrically powered heating systems on, and that would create a peak. Of course, what's true of any infrastructure is you have to design that infrastructure to cater for peak demand. It doesn't matter whether that's a transport infrastructure, an electricity infrastructure, or a water infrastructure. You have to deal and design to handle peak demand, no matter how short that peak is. And of course, if that is a very short peak, that means you're investing an awful lot of capital that will get actually very little utilization. So the big question, and one of the key challenges for this program, was how much could we mitigate that increase in peak demand and potentially shift that peak demand into the lower use periods, which is what the graph on the right shows as a potential ideal situation where all that new demand has been shifted without requiring any form of reinforcement. Is that achievable? Well, let's take a look. So again, this graph, pre-2010, potentially looking as a peak demand across the UK from electric vehicles and heat pumps, potentially something like a 30–40% increase in demand if that demand is not controllable and is not spread with all the capital investment that would mean in terms of the infrastructure. So what did we discover through the work on electrification of heat and transport? What this graph shows you is, and for those of you familiar with utilities, the infrastructures are designed based on diversity factors. So if you have a single vehicle, then you have to account for its full demand and design for that. But as the number of vehicles increases, not all those vehicles will be charging at any given time. And what this graph shows is actually 10 vehicles, the central theory is you can derate their combined demand by a factor of about 0.6, so about 60% of demand. But the bar shows there's quite a lot of uncertainty. You get up to 54 vehicles, and the diversity factor that you can apply is around a quarter, 24.8%. And you can see that the uncertainty bar has decreased. You've got a high level of confidence that with a high level of penetration of electric vehicles, you don't need to increase the capacity of your network by 54 times the demand of those vehicles. You only need to do it by about 13 times the demand of those vehicles. And one of the big positives of this, and one of the outcomes, is UK Power Networks have already taken that curve through and are now using it in the design and planning of their networks. So if we move on to look at the wind twinning aspect of this project, if you recall what I said, this was very much looking at whether consumers were willing to move their demand to when supply was available. And this was done based on giving them a price signal to do so. Now remember that in the majority of British homes today, there is actually relatively little controllable demand. We don't have heat pumps. We don't predominantly have electric vehicles. And what these trials showed was actually, if you give consumers a level of notice and a level of reward, there is a material move in terms of their demand. The most engaged consumers, 150 watts per household, given the fact they have very little controllable demand, translates to about 5% of their overall demand. Now, if they could offset the charging of their electric vehicle, or perhaps not run their heating system for 15 minutes, and those are 3 kilowatt loads, that becomes a much more significant demand that you can shift. But we didn't just do this as quantified data. Some of the participants in the trial were asked to keep diaries of what actions they actually took to either reduce or increase their demand. And we got some wonderful insights from some of the most engaged consumers, where at the very extreme end, some people were actually looking and planning their diets and what they were going to eat based on their energy price. So were they going to cook in the oven if it was an electric oven, or perhaps use their gas hob instead, so they would reduce their electricity demand? And we even had one individual who was making choices as to whether he had salad for his evening meal versus something hot. which gives you an indication of how committed some people can be if you get the incentives and you get the motivation right. But perhaps one of the most critical findings is captured at the bottom here, and that's the opportunity to move people away from, if they want to control their overall expenditure on electricity, then they have to reduce their energy consumption. And potentially that can lead to energy austerity. We have a phrase over here where some of our more vulnerable and poorer families are making choices between, do they heat their homes, or do they eat? Do they have the money when energy costs are high to actually get those luxuries, or even buy the necessary groceries and prepare them? So the affordability of your energy bill moves from how much you use to when you use it. Because if you're using it when there's abundance of supply, you can get, through these dynamic time of use tariffs, much cheaper usage rates. And obviously, latterly, the volumes of electric vehicles are increasing, but critically, we're also seeing a whole new market being established in the provision of home energy storage through things like home energy battery stores. And I'm sure you're familiar with brands like Powerwall and Powervault, where you can take energy in, put it into storage when it's cheap, and then draw it down and continue to use energy when energy is more expensive. So here's some of the other quantified findings that we took from our surveys of the participants in these trials, and particularly around understanding whether these people thought dynamic time of use tariffs were a good idea. So 71% thought that this sort of tariff gave them more awareness and more control over their energy. 9 out of 10 wanted to see them continued and should be offered more widely. They saw the benefit. 3/4 said they wanted to stay on the full dynamic time of use tariffs. And critically, 4 out of 5 people, 79%, didn't find them difficult to use or participate in. And that's got to be one of the keys, I think, to get people on board, is it has to be simple. And clearly, home automation can make it even simpler for people. So some of the key findings there, but some of the final learning that we take out of this, the benefits accrue to different parties across the value chain, and the benefits are driven by the level of uptake of low carbon technologies and whether they're concentrated, particularly for a network operator like UK Power Networks. Are they concentrated on an individual network at a sufficient level such that if you can smooth that demand out, you can defer or completely avoid investment in reinforcing that network? One of my opening comments here was about the importance of collaboration across the value chain and between parties, and this was supported through the entirety of the programme. That very, very clearly there has to be coordination across our retail suppliers with the local authorities, like the Mayor's office in London, such that the right sort of mechanisms and the right sort of education of consumers is in place. Every consumer is different and has different profiles. Residential are very different to working with businesses that might have large levels of controllable demand, rather than lots of smaller levels that have to be aggregated up to make it of value. And the commercial arrangements that we put in place with these organisations need to be different to meet the sort of incentives that each segment finds to be of value. But I think one of the key findings, particularly for a networks business, was that you have to be able to generate the value across the whole of the energy system. And that particularly in the domestic aspects, because of the low concentrations, because the low carbon technologies have not reached a sufficient level of penetration yet, accessing that as a means of managing peak demand on networks, managing network constraints, isn't currently economic for the DNOs. It will be in the future, they're sure of this, but at the moment their focus is on working with accessing demand side flexibility from larger commercial and industrial companies. And this is, I used the term avoidance and deferral earlier. Avoidance goes back to that graph I showed when I was talking about electric vehicles and being able to shift demand such that you do not have any increase in peak demand, and therefore you can fully avoid any capital investment in infrastructural reinforcement. Deferral is saying, actually I can use smart techniques, but I acknowledge that demand is going to continue to grow, but at some point in the future I will need to reinforce that network. And this was one of the key findings for UK Power Networks, was that actually deferring network reinforcement for a period of time still has a material impact on the affordability of energy, the amount of money that you have to spend in terms of the network charges. So key takeaways from the project. This collaboration across stakeholder groups, from policymakers through local communities to the players in the energy value chain, all have to work together to realise the full value. It changes commercial arrangements across the board, and it changes business operating models. It changes organisational relationships and cultures. Much more information oriented, much more real time. The DNO's IT systems architecture, all aspects of it are going to be touched by this transition to smart grids and distribution system operation. But a lot of those changes are expected to be evolutionary rather than a fundamental big change. And perhaps that's not overly surprising, given the fact that the change will be incremental through the adoption of low carbon technologies on both sides of their networks. And finally, I think the final point here is that Low Carbon London did unequivocally demonstrate that DSR has a value in terms of the way distribution businesses design and operate their infrastructures, and the learning has given them real confidence to adopt these new ways of designing and building their infrastructures, and in terms of operating those infrastructures. Finally, I said I'd give you potentially some homework if you're keen to do it. All the output reports from Low Carbon London are available at this web link on the UK Power Networks site. And I think it's Einstein said that if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it well enough. CGI to get engagement from not just our clients, but from across anybody who's interested in these areas, work with Wiley, producing a set of dummies guides, which hopefully make a lot of this complexity more accessible to people. So that's most of my presentation. I'm open to questions if anybody has any. Ted, I think I saw one come in while I was speaking.
Don't don't see it. Maybe it's in the chat window, Rich, but it's not. If you guys hover your cursor, you'll be able to post questions within the Q&A function. I guess one of the things while people are thinking about questions, Rich, one thing that I wondered was when you look at where low carbon London sort of wants to end up, what kind of percentages or proportions would you see between the renewable energy sources like solar compared to wind compared to nuclear? What kind of percentage makeup do you think you'll end up with low carbon London? Or
well, across the board in the UK, because a lot of generation will still be central. I think that they're talking about in terms of capacity it being roughly a third.
Mm-hmm.
So about a third of it will come from these less flexible solar arrays, wind arrays, which is a key and a positive. But of course, the capacity is different from the amount of energy that's used. And we have had days in the UK recently where renewable energy has been satisfying all demand,
mm-hmm.
which is a real positive, and is certainly now starting to outstrip the amount of generation coming from certainly the old coal plants on a regular basis.
So, Rich, you were saying that nuclear makes up a third of the spectrum?
Potentially, yes. You might have seen in the press we've recently in the UK just commissioned the first new nuclear power station, I think for 20 or 30 years in Hinkley Point C, and that will make a significant contribution because quite a lot of our nuclear generating capacity retires in the mid-2020s,
mm-hmm.
which is about the time that Hinkley Point C is due to come back onto the generation system.
Now, one of the things that I wonder about too, and sort of comparing the UK to, say, for example, Germany, it seemed to me that there was a fair amount of subsidization of renewable energy sources within Germany. Did you have the same sort of proposition within the UK?
Yeah, it depends where you talk about it going. So in the domestic sector, there's been quite a lot of fiscal incentives around what we call feed-in tariffs,
mm-hmm.
for particularly for solar. In the larger end, then again there are subsidies or fiscal incentives rather than subsidies around things like contracts for difference. So mm-hmm. we will provide, or the government provides, long-term contracts for difference, whereby if the wholesale market price is higher than that strike price, if you can use that term for wind or solar, then the wind or solar generator still only gets the contracted price. If it's less than that agreed contractual price, then they effectively receive a subsidy. So it provides the certainty to make those sort of significant capital investments in sort of central generating capacity. The one thing I would say about all fiscal incentives is they're really there to commercialize these technologies. So as these technologies start to achieve cost reductions because they become more mainstream and the technologies mature, then the level of those fiscal incentives starts to come down.
Now, Rich, did you have kind of energy innovation or incubator type labs?
We as CGI or UK?
Well, just generally within the low carbon London program.
So certainly via Imperial College London, they set up the Learning Lab, and they did a lot of the more detailed analysis work on the findings that were coming out of Low Carbon London, and validating the hypotheses and driving the learning. Because of course some of the most valuable learning comes from when those hypotheses aren't proven, and sitting there and scratching your head as to perhaps why things haven't gone as expected, and what are the factors that we missed.
Now, from your experience with the Low Carbon London project, Rich, what kind of directions are you headed in that would be of benefit for our listeners to be exposed to?
So I think for me, I see this very much as a continuum. So I talked earlier about the deployment of smart meters, creating the foundation for the move to smart grids. And that's about the information that can come off smart meters, but it also provides the means of communicating to consumers and getting consumers engaged and rewarding consumers, because you can do things like dynamic time of use tariffing. You then move into the smart grids, making use of that insight and more detailed understanding of what's actually happening at a more granular level on your infrastructure. And that moves towards smart grids. But then we move to what's certainly over here in Europe is being called distribution system operation. So this is where consumers are really truly starting to control their demand, or potentially exporting energy back onto the networks. And when you start to do that, that becomes much more real time. It requires much stronger information management skills. And that for me is very much a continuum. And if you get into connected consumers, and let's face it, we already have connected consumers to a large degree in the industrial and commercial world. There is precedent. But for us as domestic consumers, who through buying electric vehicles or choosing to have some form of battery storage device in our homes, if we have the ability to store and change when we take energy, then it becomes a very different proposition. We do become prosumers. And then we become smarter citizens, and you can see that moving wider into smart cities, because we're all individuals moving around cities. So choosing when we charge, how we move around the city, how we move our vehicles to charging points, how we get them charged at appropriate times. And it does become much more of a people thing, much more of a behavioral change thing.
And on that note, Rich, is there, like within Low Carbon London, is there kind of a feedback mechanism to consumers that essentially kind of gives them a scorecard or some sort of a feedback about energy choices and the impact that it has, say, on their own kind of a budget, for example? And I guess what I'm looking at is a way of using a billing or feedback mechanism to help consumers understand the choices and their impacts on them.
Yeah, so certainly that was very, very much part of it. And excuse me a moment. Those consumers that were actively involved and the ones involved with the dynamic time of use trials were receiving messages to let them know ahead of time when they would have low price periods or high price periods that would enable them to potentially have a salad for tea, to use the anecdote that I shared. Equally, that was being reflected in terms of the pricing and how much they could potentially save by shifting their demand.
No, this has been excellent, Rich. I mean, I think what people should be aware of is we're recording the presentation right now, and of course we post all of the presentations to our partners, the MCCAC YouTube channel, so anybody can kind of find the archives of all of our presentations just by searching within YouTube for the MCCAC acronym. This has been a fascinating presentation, and I'm so happy that you were willing to participate and present into the series, Rich. It's been wonderful.
Absolute pleasure, Ted. And I hope everybody's found something that they can take away from it. As I say, there's some links at the end of this presentation if people want to do some more research of their own, or my contact details are there as well if anybody wants to drop me an email or a note.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for presenting into the series. At 11 o'clock this morning Mountain Time, we have another presentation by Dr. Seal Malawi of Laval University on kind of taking a look at citizen monitoring of feedback through social media channels. And thanks so much, Rich, for doing this presentation. It's been wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks so much, Rich. Bye now.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.